In the year 1347, a merchant ship drifted into the Sicilian port of Messina with a cargo of death. By the time the sailors stepped onto the docks, they weren't just carrying spices or silks. They were carrying an invisible, unstoppable plague that would erase half of Europe from the map. We are talking about the Black Death. We are talking about the Yersinia pestis bacterium. And we are talking about a hole in the ground in England that changes everything we know about how a civilization collapses. But before we get to that hole in the ground, you need to understand something. This wasn't a slow tragedy. This wasn't a disease that crept in over decades while people adjusted and adapted. This was a wave, a wall of death that moved across an entire continent in less time than it takes most of us to plan a vacation. So let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning, to a world that had no idea what was coming. Long before it reached Messina, the plague had a different home. Historians and scientists now believe the disease originated in the plains of Central Asia, carried silently by fleas living on the backs of black rats. For centuries, these rodents had traveled alongside merchants on the Silk Road, that vast network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. In 1346, a Mongol army laid siege to the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Crimean coast. According to chronicles from the period, the attackers were dying by the thousands from a mysterious illness. In an act of early biological warfare, they are said to have catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, hoping to spread the sickness to those trapped inside. It worked, but it didn't stay contained. The merchants trapped in Kaffa fled by ship, desperate to escape. They sailed west toward home, unaware that they were carrying something far more dangerous than any weapon. By the time their ships reached Messina in 1347, most of the sailors on board were already dead or dying. The few who remained alive were covered in strange black swellings. Authorities tried to turn the ships away. It didn't matter. The rats had already slipped down the ropes. The fleas had already found new hosts. The plague was ashore, and there was no calling it back. From Sicily, it spread like ink dropped into water. Genoa, Marseille. Within a year, it had reached Paris. Within 2 years, it had crossed the English Channel. And that brings us to London. Imagine London in 1348. It was a crowded, filthy, bustling metropolis, home to somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 people crammed inside walls that had barely expanded since Roman times. The streets were narrow, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. The houses were timber and thatch, packed so tightly that fire and disease could leap from one household to the next in a matter of hours. There was no sewage system in the modern sense. Waste ran through open gutters in the middle of the street. Butchers dumped animal remains into the Thames. Rats were everywhere, nesting in walls, in grain stores, in the straw that lined every floor. People lived right on top of their own waste. It was, in every sense of the word, the perfect ecosystem for a nightmare. Then, the rumors started. They said a sickness was traveling north from Italy. They said it turned your skin black. They said your glands swelled into tumors the size of apples. In the neck, the armpits, the groin. They said the victims screamed in pain for days before finally falling silent. Most people didn't believe it until it was knocking on their own front door. The disease itself came in 3 brutal forms. The bubonic form attacked the lymphatic system, producing the infamous swellings, or buboes, that gave the plague its name. The septicemic form poisoned the blood directly, turning the skin black as tissue died beneath it, which is likely where the name Black Death came from. And the pneumonic form attacked the lungs, spreading directly from person to person through the air with a mortality rate that approached 100%. There was no explanation for any of it. Doctors at the time didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about fleas or rat populations. Some blamed the alignment of the planets. Others blamed sin. Some blamed foreigners. And that blame turned into violence, into massacres of Jewish communities across Europe who were falsely accused of poisoning the wells. Fear, when it has nowhere else to go, always looks for someone to punish. When the plague reached London in the autumn of 1348, it didn't just kill the sick. It killed the city. The mortality rate was staggering. Experts estimate that within just a few months, between 30 and 50% of the entire population of London was dead. Some historians argue the number climbed even higher in the poorest, most densely packed parishes. Think about your neighborhood. Think about every second house on your street. Now imagine everyone inside those homes dying in the span of a single week. And then imagine that week repeating itself over and over for nearly a year. The legal system collapsed. Courts stopped sitting because there were no judges, no clerks, juries left to fill the benches. The churches stopped ringing bells because there was nobody left to pull the ropes, and even if there had been, the sound of funeral bells had become so constant that it offered no comfort, only dread. Priests, who spent their days administering last rites to the dying, died in numbers so high that entire parishes were left without clergy. Fields were left untended because the farmers who worked them were dead or too afraid to leave their homes. Livestock wandered into the streets and died in the mud, their carcasses rotting where they fell, because there was nobody left to butcher them or bury them. The economy didn't just slow down. In entire districts, it ceased to exist. Markets closed. Ships sat empty in the docks. Trade, the very thing that had carried the plague to London's shores, now had nowhere to go. Contemporary chroniclers described a city that had forgotten how to function. Wills were being written and rewritten within days because the person who inherited the property would themselves be dead before the ink had dried. Family units were wiped out entirely, sometimes in a matter of hours. A husband and wife and all of their children gone before the sun rose twice. For centuries afterward, historians relied on tax records, parish logs, and the scattered, often exaggerated accounts of monks and chroniclers to guess the scale of this catastrophe. But numbers on a dusty scroll are one thing. Bones in the dirt are another. In 2013, construction crews working on the Crossrail project in London made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. They were digging a route for a new underground rail line tunneling through the ancient layers of the city, expecting to find little more than old foundations, broken pottery, and forgotten cellars. They were digging near Charterhouse Square, a quiet, tree-lined patch of green space in the heart of London, surrounded today by hospitals, offices, and apartment buildings. Nobody walking across that square on an ordinary afternoon would have guessed what lay beneath their feet. Instead of foundations, crews hit the Charterhouse burial ground. This wasn't just any graveyard. Historical records had long hinted that a mass burial site existed somewhere near this location, established in 1348 specifically because the city's regular churchyards had run out of space. But nobody had located it with certainty until Crossrail's excavators broke through. This was a purpose-built trench. Excavators unearthed skeletons carefully arranged in rows, dozens of them, layered with a grim, methodical precision. It was systematic. It was efficient. Was evidence of a society that was desperately trying to bury the dead with whatever dignity it could manage before the sheer number of bodies made even that impossible. But the real discovery wasn't just the skeletons. It was the DNA. Scientists carefully extracted samples from the teeth of those buried at Charterhouse. Teeth, protected by hard enamel, can preserve genetic material for centuries in ways that soft tissue never could. Inside that ancient dental pulp, researchers found what they were looking for. They extracted the ancient DNA of the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This was the smoking gun. For centuries, some historians had debated whether the Black Death was truly caused by this specific bacterium, or whether it might have been some other pathogen entirely, perhaps a viral hemorrhagic fever, given how quickly it spread and how brutally it killed. The Charterhouse DNA settled the debate. Proved beyond any doubt that the Black Death wasn't some undefined plague of legend. It was a relentless biological scythe that cut through the human population with surgical, microscopic precision. And the skeletons told an even deeper story than just cause of death. Look closely at the bones, and you can see the markers of the famine that preceded the plague, remnants of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, years of catastrophic rainfall destroyed harvests across northern Europe. You can see the signs of malnutrition in the bone structure, in stunted growth, in the telltale lines that form on bones when a body has been starved and then recovered, only to be starved again. The city was already weak. Its population was already undernourished, already living on the edge of collapse. The plague didn't create the vulnerability. It simply found it, and it exploited it without mercy. When you study these skeletons, aren't looking at the past. You are looking at a mirror. The consequences of the Black Death didn't end when the bodies stopped piling up. In many ways, that's where the story becomes even more remarkable. The Black Death killed so many peasants, so many laborers, that the survivors suddenly found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. Before the plague, there had been far more workers than there was work, which kept wages low and kept peasants tied to the land under the rigid structure of feudalism. After the plague, labor became scarce, and scarce labor became valuable. Peasants began demanding higher wages. When landlords refused, workers simply left, moving to estates that would pay them what they were worth. Laws were passed trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but they largely failed because there simply weren't enough hands left to enforce the old order. The rigid, centuries-old structure of feudal Europe. A system that had seemed permanent and unshakable, cracked under the weight of a microscopic bacterium. Historians now argue that the Black Death, for all its horror, helped sow the seeds of the Renaissance. It broke the power of the old feudal lords, forced survivors to question a church that had promised protection and delivered none. It created social and economic mobility in a world that had never known it before. Out of one of the greatest catastrophes in human history came, eventually, new ideas, new art, science, and a fundamentally different Europe. But it came at the price of an estimated 75 to 200 million lives across Europe and Asia. It came at the price of entire villages disappearing from maps entirely, their names surviving only in old records, their populations never returning. We look back at these skeletons and we feel a sense of distance. We tell ourselves we are safe in our sterile, modern world with our antibiotics, our sanitation systems, our disease surveillance networks. But the Charterhouse burial ground is a warning, not a relic. It is a reminder that our modern cities are, in their own way, still high-density feeding grounds for the next great biological challenge. Think about it. In the 14th century, was the Silk Road that brought the plague from the plains of Central Asia to the docks of London. A journey that took roughly 2 years. In the 21st century, that same journey, city to city, continent to continent, takes less than a single day, carried not by ships and rats, but by international flight paths connecting hundreds of millions of travelers every single year. We are hyper-connected. We are urbanized at a scale medieval London could never have imagined. We are dependent on global supply chains that span thousands of miles, chains that can be disrupted by a single outbreak, a single closed border, a single overwhelmed hospital system. The Charterhouse grave proves that collapse isn't always a slow burn. Sometimes it is a landslide. It starts with one ship. It starts with one cough. It starts with a system that has no backup plan for when the human cost exceeds the social capacity to absorb it. In London, at the height of the crisis, they stopped burying people in individual plots with prayers and ceremony. They stopped performing last rites for every soul. They just dug trenches. They layered bodies like firewood, one on top of another, and covered them with a thin layer of soil before moving on to the next trench, because there was always a next trench waiting to be filled. So, here is the question worth sitting with. How quickly would your city stop functioning if the systems you rely on simply stopped? How long would the shelves remain stocked if supply chains broke down for even a few weeks? How many neighbors would you lose? How much silence would settle over your street? For that silence became louder than the fear itself. The plague of 1348 didn't just end lives. It ended a world. It showed us, in the cruelest way possible, that we are only ever a few missed heartbeats away from a total societal reset. The graves at Charterhouse are now buried under the modern streets of London, quietly resting beneath office buildings, hospitals, and a peaceful square where people eat their lunch on sunny afternoons. Thousands of commuters walk over that ground every single day, completely unaware that beneath their feet lies the physical, genetic evidence of how easily an entire civilization can be brought to its knees. We think we are the masters of our environment. We think our progress, our technology, our medicine makes us untouchable. The dirt knows better. The dirt remembers the days when the tolling of church bells was the loudest sound in the city, and then remembers the days after, when there was no one left to ring them at all. And if we aren't careful, if we keep ignoring the fragility of the systems we've built our entire modern world upon, the dirt may one day be the only thing left to tell our story.